The concert hall was a capsule of warm golden light against the crisp autumn night outside. It wasn't the city's largest venue, but it was its most cherished, a place of rich wood and perfect acoustics where every whispered note could be heard in the highest balcony. Tonight, every velvet seat was filled with a hushed, expectant energy. They had all come to see one man. On stage, under the gentle glow of a single spotlight, sat the pianist. He was a man known as much for his fingers as for his smile of playful, sometimes mischievous charm that seeped into his performances. His name was Arlo Thorne, and to the world of classical music, he was a rock star. He didn't just play the piano. He conversed with it, teased it, and commanded it. And he loved, more than anything, to play with his audience. He was finishing a lighter piece, something by Debussy that shimmered like sunlight on water. As the last note lingered and faded into silence, the room erupted in applause. He stood, gave a small theatrical bow, and instead of walking off, he grabbed a wireless microphone and stepped to the edge of the stage. "Thank you. Thank you," he said, his voice a warm, friendly baritone that carried easily. "You know, these concerts can sometimes feel very serious." He paused, letting the word hang. A few knowing chuckles came from the crowd. All of us on our best behavior, me in my penguin suit. He plucked at his white tie disdainfully, earning more laughter. But music, real music, isn't just about perfection. It's about feeling. It's about connection. He walked along the stage, his shoes making soft taps on the hardwood. Sometimes I think we forget the sheer joy of just making sound. He reached the grand piano and ran a single finger down a row of keys, producing a playful, tinkling scale. When I was a boy, my greatest pleasure wasn't playing Chopin. It was sneaking into the music room when no one was looking and just hitting the keys, seeing what noises I could make. The audience was utterly captivated. This was the Arlo Thorne they loved, the one who broke down the invisible wall between the stage and the seats. He made the monumental feel personal. "So," he continued, leaning against the piano now, "I have a proposition. A little experiment." His eyes, a bright blue even from a distance, twinkled. "This magnificent instrument shouldn't be lonely when I'm over here talking. Would anyone, and I mean anyone, like to come up and play a little something? A nursery rhyme? A scale? The opening notes of chopsticks? No judgment, I promise. Just for fun." A wave of nervous tittering swept through the hall. People sank slightly lower in their seats, smiling but avoiding his gaze. No one wanted to be that person, the well-meaning amateur, who would fumble in front of 1,000 people and a world-class maestro. It was a sweet offer, but surely it was a setup for a gentle, communal joke. Arlo's eyes scanned the rows, his grin inviting. He saw a young man who immediately shook his head, blushing. He saw an older woman who waved her hand as if to say, "Oh, not me, dear." His gaze traveled over the sea of faces, all eager to watch, none eager to participate. Then he saw her. She was sitting in the third row, slightly off-center. In her late 30s, perhaps, with a quiet, composed presence. She wasn't dressed for a gala. She wore a simple, dark green sweater, and her hair was tied back in a no-nonsense manner. But it was her expression that caught him. While everyone else was looking at him with amusement or anticipation, she was looking past him at the piano. Her focus was deep and absolute. She wasn't just listening to his banter. She seemed to be studying the instrument, the space, the very air around the stage. Her eyes held a strange, knowing distance, as if she were mentally measuring the distance from the bench to the pedals dot. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of a pianist. A new, more impish idea sparked in Arlo's mind. The game was no longer about finding a willing volunteer for a laugh. It was a test, a curiosity. What was this woman's story? You? He said softly into the microphone, then pointed. All heads in her vicinity turned. The woman seemed to startle, pulled from her thoughts. She looked around, confirming he meant her. A faint pink flush crept up her neck. Yes, you, Arlo continued, his voice warm but persistent. The lady in the green, with the very thoughtful eyes. You look like you have a secret. Would you care to come share it with us? Play a note or two? Humor an old showman? The audience's attention focused on her like a laser. Some smiled encouragingly. Others whispered. Her companion, a friend perhaps, nudged her with an elbow, a go-on, expression on her face. The woman, whose name was Elena, felt 1,000 eyes on her. This was her nightmare, and a deeply buried part of her soul, a forgotten fantasy. She hadn't touched a piano in a public space in over 15 years. Her hands, which now clenched in her lap, were more accustomed to holding surgical clamps than shaping melodies for a crowd dot. She shook her head slightly, a polite refusal. But Arlo Thorne was a master of persuasion. He walked to the very edge of the stage above her and extended his hand, not as a command, but as an invitation. I promise, the piano doesn't bite. And neither do we. Just one little sound. For courage. The hall was quiet, waiting. It was the kind of silence that pushes you forward. Elena looked at his outstretched hand, then at the majestic black grand piano gleaming under the lights. A war raged inside her fear, against a sudden, fierce, and shocking pull. The music she had locked away for so long stirred, like an animal waking from a long hibernation. Slowly, as if moving through water, she stood up. A soft, supportive patter of applause broke out. She didn't smile. Her face was a mask of intense concentration. She moved past the knees of her seatmates and into the aisle. Her steps were measured, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if each one required careful calculation. She reached the steps at the side of the stage. A young stagehand offered a steadying arm, which she took. And then she was there, on the same sacred boards as Arlo Thorne, the vast, dark sea of the audience, now a blur before her. The lights were hotter up close. The scale of the piano seemed enormous. Arlo met her in the center of the stage, taking her hand. He could feel a slight tremble in her fingers, but her grip was firm. "And what is your name?" he asked gently, his voice now just for her and the microphone. "Elena," she said, her voice quiet but clear, without a trace of theatricality. "Welcome." "Elena," he said, leading her to the bench. "The stage is yours. Don't be nervous. We're all friends here." He gave her a final charming smile and stepped back, leaning against the piano lid with his arms folded, ready for a sweet, simple, perhaps clumsy rendition of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." The audience settled in, their collective mood one of warm, slightly patronizing encouragement. They were ready to applaud her effort, her bravery, to be part of Arlo's lovely, humanizing bit of theater. Elena sat down. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at Arlo. She looked only at the keys. A black and white landscape she knew intimately, a geography she had once navigated every day of her life. She ran a hand lightly over the smooth wood of the fallboard, a touch almost like a greeting. She adjusted the bench an inch a pianist's micro-adjustment. She placed her feet on the pedals. Then she closed her eyes. And she waited. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. It began to feel awkward. Someone coughed. Arlo's smile became fixed. He wondered if he had pushed too far, misread her completely. Perhaps she was frozen by stage fright. Just as he was about to step forward and kindly relieve her, Elena opened her eyes. They were no longer distant or nervous. They were sharp, clear, and filled with a profound, focused intensity. She took a deep, slow breath that lifted her shoulders and then released it, her body settling into a perfect poised posture. Her hands lifted, fingers curved with a natural, innate grace, and hovered above the key's dot. In that instant, the air in the room changed. The warmth of shared amusement evaporated, replaced by a sudden electric tension. Arlo uncrossed his arms, his playful demeanor vanishing. He straightened up. He knew that posture. He knew that look. Before a single thought could form in anyone's mind, Helena's hands descended, and the joke was over. The silence before the first note was a living thing. It stretched and thickened in the concert hall, pressing down on the audience. It had started as a gentle, expectant pause, the kind that comes before a friend tries to remember a tune. But with each passing second, as Elena simply sat there with her eyes closed, it had turned into something else. It became awkward. It became heavy. People shifted in their velvet seats. A program rustled. Someone near the back let out a small, stifled cough that sounded like a firecracker in the quiet. The warm, supportive smiles in the crowd began to falter, replaced by looks of concern. They felt for her. They could all imagine themselves in that terrible, spotlighted moment, frozen by 1,000 staring eyes. On stage, Arlo Thorne's own easy smile had stiffened. A tiny knot of regret tightened in his stomach. This was his fault. He had seen a look on her face, a spark of something, and he had pushed. He had mistaken deep thought for a willingness to perform. Now, a woman was suffering a very public moment of fear because of his playful whim. His mind raced for a graceful way out. He could step forward, put a kind hand on her shoulder, and say something to break the tension. He could make a joke about the piano being shy tonight. He would apologize to her, and the audience would applaud her courage anyway. And the evening would move on. He took half a step forward, opening his mouth. That was when Elena opened her eyes. It wasn't a slow, dawning awareness. It was a sudden, complete arrival. The distant, thoughtful woman from the third row was gone. In her place was someone entirely present, focused to a razor's edge. Her gaze was not on the audience, not on him, but on the landscape of black and white keys before her. There was no panic in that look. There was recognition. There was a deep, almost sorrowful knowledge. Arlo froze, his planned words dying on his lips. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror before a difficult passage. He had seen it in the eyes of the great masters he'd studied under. It was the look of total immersion, the moment when the outside world falls away and there is only the music waiting to be born. Before he could process this shift, Elena moved. Her hands, which had been resting lightly in her lap, lifted. It was not a dramatic, theatrical gesture. It was economical, purposeful. Her shoulders dropped, her spine straightened into a perfect, relaxed alignment. Her fingers curved over the keys with a natural, unforced arch that made Arlo's own pianist heart give a silent nod of approval. That was not the shape of someone who remembered a few childhood lessons. That was the shape of technique, deeply ingrained. The audience seemed to hold its collective breath. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a new, puzzled tension. This didn't look like someone preparing to plink out chopsticks. Elena took one last, deep breath. And then she began. The sound that came from the piano was not one note or two. It was a great, resonant, low chord that seemed to roll out from the heart of the instrument like distant thunder. It wasn't loud, but it was full. It vibrated in the wood of the floor and in the chests of the people listening. Before that sound could fade, her right hand leaped into motion. A cascade of high, mournful notes fell like freezing rain, a melody so instantly heartbreaking and beautiful that a woman in the front row physically pressed a hand to her heart. It was a melody everyone knew, even if they didn't know its name. It was the opening of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto, one of the most famous, most difficult, and most emotionally powerful pieces ever written for the instrument. And she wasn't just playing the notes. She was playing. Her left hand joined, building a complex foundation of harmony that rumbled and surged. The tempo was deliberate, stately, laden with a profound emotion that seemed too vast to come from this quiet woman in a simple sweater. Her body moved with the music, not in wild gestures, but in a subtle, unified flow. She leaned into the phrases, her head tilting as if listening to a voice only she could hear. Her face was a mask of fierce concentration and deep feeling. On the side of the stage, Arlo Thorne was no longer leaning. He was standing perfectly still, his arms hanging limp at his sides. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly agape. All the charming mischief had been wiped from his face, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. This was impossible. This was a dream. He was a master of this concerto. He knew every punishing octave, every treacherous leap. What she was doing wasn't just competent. It was masterful. It had a raw, emotional truth to it that made his professional soul ache. He listened for a mistake, a hesitation, a simplification of the brutal chords. There were none. The audience was transformed. Those who knew the piece stared in disbelief. Those who didn't were simply swept away by the sheer, powerful beauty of it. The earlier atmosphere of a playful shared joke was a distant memory. This was a concert. A real, serious, breathtaking concert. People stopped looking at Arlo. All eyes were glued to the woman at the piano, to her flying hands, to the expression of anguished beauty on her face. Elena played through the entire dramatic opening section. The music swelled and retreated, whispered and roared. She had complete control. The softest passages were like thoughts, barely formed. The powerful chords shook the air. She moved into a more turbulent, technically dazzling section. Her fingers a blur of impossible accuracy, crossing and leaping with a fearless assurance that made several musicians in the audience shake their heads in wonder that she was somewhere else. Entirely. The hall, the people, the famous pianist watching her, it had all dissolved. For her, there was only the piano and the memory. The memory of a small practice room, sunlight on the dust motes. The memory of her teacher's voice, stern and encouraging. The memory of the dream she had once held so close, a dream of stages like this one. And woven through the notes was another memory, sharper and more painful, the reason she had closed the lid on that dream so many years ago. She played for that too. She poured all of it, the joy and the loss, into the music dot as she approached the end of the concerto's famous first movement introduction. The music built to its final, aching climax. She leaned her whole body into the keys, her fingers striking the last. Thunderous chords with a power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the stage. And then, silence. A perfect, total, ringing silence. Her hands fell to her lap. She was breathing heavily, as if she had just run a great distance. She kept her head bowed for a long moment, staring at her own hands, as if surprised to find them there. The silence continued, stretched for 3 seconds, 4. It was the silence of shock, of awe, of a spell that no one wanted to break. Like a dam bursting, the sound came. It wasn't just applause. It was a roar. A physical wave of sound that hit the stage. Every single person was on their feet, shouting, clapping, crying. The noise was deafening, overwhelming. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated discovery, of witnessing something miraculous. Elena flinched, startled, as if the sound had physically struck her. She looked up, blinking, her eyes unfocused. She seemed to remember where she was, who was watching. The profound, transported artist was receding, and the quiet woman from the third row was slowly returning, looking utterly bewildered by the storm she had unleashed. Arlo Thorne was the first to move on stage. The applause seemed to break his own trance. He walked toward her, but his walk was different. It wasn't the confident stride of the showman. It was slower, almost reverent. He looked at her not with amusement, but with a kind of stunned respect. He stopped a few feet from the piano bench, and then, in a gesture that was seen by the entire hall, he bowed. It wasn't a stage bow. It was a deep, sincere bend from the waist, the kind one artist gives to another who has profoundly moved them. When he straightened, his eyes were shining. He approached her, gently offering a hand to help her stand. She took it, her own hand trembling now from the aftermath of the effort. The applause swelled even louder, mixed with cheers and whistles. He led her to the center of the stage, holding her hand aloft like a champion. She looked out at the sea of standing, clapping people, and a single stunned tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She wasn't smiling. She looked exhausted, relieved, and deeply, deeply vulnerable. Arlo raised a hand, and slowly, gradually, the incredible noise began to subside. People returned to their seats, but the energy in the room was electric, buzzing. Everyone was leaning forward, desperate to know, to understand. He turned to her. His voice, when he finally spoke into the microphone, was thick with emotion. It was no longer the voice of a performer. It was the voice of a man who had just had his world gently turned upside down. "Who?" he asked, the words simple and huge in the quiet hall. "Are you?" The applause finally, slowly, began to fade. It was as if the audience had to physically exhaust itself, to clap out all their shock and wonder before they could even think of stopping. The sound softened from a roaring ocean to a patter of rain, and then to a hushed, breathless quiet. But the energy in the room hadn't lessened. It had simply changed. It was now a pressure, a collective leaning in. Every person in that hall was hanging on the moment, waiting for the answer to the question that hung in the air. Arlo Thorne's hand was still gently holding Elena's, feeling the fine tremor that ran through her fingers. He led her back to the piano bench, not as a place for her to play anymore, but as a place to sit, to steady herself. She sank onto it, looking small and suddenly very tired under the bright lights. He pulled over the small stool he sometimes used for his chats and sat facing her, close, creating a private circle in the middle of the public stage. He kept the microphone in his other hand, his body angled to include the audience in this conversation they all needed to hear. "I asked," he said again, his voice softer now, stripped of all performance. "Who are you?" Elena looked at him, then down at her own hands resting in her lap. They were good hands, strong, with long fingers. But they were not the smooth, perfectly manicured hands of a concert pianist. There were small, faded scars near the thumb, the kind you get from tools, not from piano keys. There was a callus in a strange place on the index finger. She closed them into loose fists, and opened them again, as if unsure what they were. "My name is Elena," she said, her voice finding the microphone. It was quiet, but clear. It had a direct, factual quality to it. "Elena," Arlo repeated, as if tasting the word. "Elena, what you just did. That wasn't someone who played a little as a child. That was years. That was a life." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She didn't deny it. She looked out at the dark blur of faces, and for the first time, she seemed to really see them, to remember they were there. It seemed to give her a kind of courage, or maybe a duty, to explain. "I did play," she said, a little stronger now. "A long time ago. It was everything to me." She paused, searching for the right words in a story she likely hadn't told out loud in years. "I started when I was 4. My grandmother was a piano teacher. She said I had an ear. By the time I was 10, I was practicing 4 or 5 hours a day. It wasn't a chore. It was where I lived, inside the music. Arlo was listening intently, nodding. He knew that country. He had lived there, too. I won competitions, she continued, a faint ghost of a proud smile touching her lips and then vanishing. State ones. National ones. When I was 17, I was offered a place at a conservatory. A very good one. It was the path. The only path I had ever wanted. The hall was so silent, you could hear the hum of the lights. You could hear people breathing. This was the part of the story they all understood, the discovery of a prodigy. But they could feel the but coming. It hung in the air, heavy and sad. Elena took a breath. Her eyes lost their focus on the present, looking at a memory projected on the dark curtain behind the audience. I had a younger sister, she said, and her voice changed. It became softer, frayed at the edges. She was my biggest fan. She came to every recital, even the boring ones. She'd sit in the front row and make these funny faces at me if I looked nervous. She swallowed hard. The summer before I was supposed to leave for the conservatory, she got sick. It started with headaches. Then her vision got blurry. Then she couldn't balance. It happened so fast. Elena's fingers twisted together now, knuckles white. They found a tumor in her brain. It was in a terrible place, very deep, very risky. Arlo's face had lost all its animation. He was just watching her, his own eyes glistening. He didn't say a word. He just let her talk. The world just shrank, Elena whispered. The piano, the concerts, the future. It all just became noise. The only thing that was real was her, in that hospital room. The only sound that mattered was the beep of her monitors. She looked down at her hands again. I sat by her bed for weeks. I'd hold her hand, and I'd hum. Pieces she liked. This one, she said, gesturing faintly toward the piano. Rachmaninoff was her favorite. She said it sounded like stormy weather and brave hearts. A few sniffles could be heard in the audience. A man in the middle rows took off his glasses and wiped his eyes. She had the surgery, Elena said. Her voice was flat now, factual, the way people talk about the worst things to keep from breaking. The surgeons, they were miracles. They saved her life, but it was a long, hard road. She had to learn to walk again, to talk again. She needed help. Our parents, they were wrecked. I looked at them, and I looked at her, and I looked at the piano. And the choice wasn't a choice at all. She finally looked back at Arlo, her gaze clear and heartbreakingly direct. How? Could I go play music in a practice room 1,000 miles away when she was fighting to remember how to form a sentence? How could I chase a dream when hers had almost been taken from her? I turned down the conservatory. I stayed home. What did you do? Arlo asked, his own voice a rough whisper. A different kind of light came into Elena's eyes then. Not the fiery light of performance, but the steady, determined glow of purpose. I got a job. I went to the local college. I became obsessed with the very thing that had tried to take her. I studied biology, then neuroscience. I worked in labs. I volunteered at the hospital. Every time I learned something new about the brain, I felt like I was getting a little piece of her back. It was harder than the piano, so much harder. But it mattered in a different way. She held up her hands. These hands? They learned to hold a scalpel. They learned to suture, to operate delicate equipment. They forgot how to find chords without thinking. The piano, it became a ghost in my house. A beautiful, silent ghost. I'd walk past it sometimes and just hurt, so I stopped walking past it. I closed the lid. She let out a long, shaky breath. Tonight, my sister is doing well. She's married. She has a little boy. She's the reason I'm here, actually. She bought me this ticket for my birthday. She said, "You need to remember what beauty sounds like from the outside." She forced me to come. Elena looked out. At the audience, her expression one of stunned disbelief, as if she had just woken up. "I was sitting out there, listening to you play," she said to Arlo, "and it was like hearing a language I used to dream in. I was just remembering. I wasn't planning to come up here. It was the last thing in the world I wanted to do." A faint, real smile finally appeared. "But you have a very persuasive way about you." A ripple of warm, cheerful laughter moved through the crowd. The tension broke, but the emotion in the room was deeper than ever. Arlo was quiet for a long moment. He looked at this woman, this doctor, this scientist, this ghost of a pianist who had just played one of the most emotionally true performances he had ever witnessed. He thought of his own life, of the single-minded pursuit of his art, and he felt a humility so vast it was dizzying. He slowly stood up. He looked at the audience, then back at Elena. He took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and his voice was thick but clear. "Tonight, I came here to perform for you. But instead, I think we have all received a gift. We came for music, and we were given a lesson in courage. We came for technique, and we were shown the meaning of sacrifice." He turned to Elena. "You said you turned away from one dream to serve something more important, but I think the music never left you. It was just waiting. Thank you for sharing it with us." He reached out, not for a handshake, but placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was a gesture of deep respect. The audience understood. The applause started again, not the wild roar of discovery, but something warmer, fuller, a sustained, standing ovation that was meant for her whole story, for her heart, for the silent years she had spent in service of love. Elena didn't stand to bow. She just sat on the piano bench, absorbing the sound, letting it wash over her. The ghost in her house was silent no more. And for the first time in a very, very long time, the music inside her didn't feel like a loss. It just felt like a part of her that had, against all odds, finally been allowed to speak. The applause this time was different. It wasn't the explosive, shocked roar from before. This was deeper, slower, like a steady heartbeat from the crowd. It was full of respect and warmth and a shared feeling that they had all been let in on something precious and private. It was applause for a person, not just a performance. On stage, Elena simply sat on the piano bench, letting the sound wash over her. She looked drained, but there was a new softness in her face. The tight knot of concentration and buried pain had loosened. She looked, for the first time all night, at peace. She gave a small, humble nod to the audience, but didn't stand. It was as if all her strength had been used up in the playing and the telling. Arlo Thorne finally raised his hands, gently patting the air to signal the crowd to quiet down. They listened, settling back into their seats with a collective rustle. The air was thick with emotion. He looked at Elena, then out at the faces, all glowing in the dim light. "I think," Arlo began, his voice still carrying that raw, unpolished honesty, "that we should probably let Elena take a breath, and maybe get her a very large glass of water." A quiet, understanding chuckle rippled through the hall. "But if you'll indulge me, and if Elena agrees, I'd like to. I don't know. Just talk for a moment. Not as a performer tonight, but as a person who is feeling very, very small in the best possible way." He pulled his stool a little closer to her. He didn't have all the answers. He was making this up as he went along, led by his heart. "Your story, it changes the room, you know," he said to her, but also to everyone listening. "I've spent my whole life thinking that music was the most important thing, that getting the notes right, the feeling right, that was the highest calling. And I still believe it's a beautiful calling. But you showed us it's not the only one. that there is a music in silence, in sacrifice, in showing up for someone you love when they need you. Elena listened, her hands folded in her lap. She gave another small nod, accepting his words. "Can I ask," Arlo said, leaning forward a little, "what it felt like? Sitting down here after all these years? Not in your living room, but here, with all of us watching?" Elena was quiet for a few seconds, thinking. She reached out and touched the edge of a piano key, but didn't press it. It was like walking into a house you grew up in, but someone else has been living there for a long time, she said slowly. The walls are the same, the floors creak in the same places, but the furniture is different. The smell is different. At first, it's terrifying. You feel like a ghost in your own past. She looked at her hand on the key. But then, you find the one spot where the sunlight still falls in the same way on the floorboards in the morning. And for a minute, you're home again. The music. It was that spot of sunlight. It was still there. I just hadn't let myself stand in it for a very long time. The poetic simplicity of her answer brought a fresh wave of sniffs and wiped eyes from the audience. Arlo smiled. A genuine, warm smile. "Well, for what it's worth, you brought that sunlight into this whole room tonight." He shifted on his stool. "You're a neuroscientist? A doctor?" "I'm a resident in neurosurgery," Elena corrected gently. "I'm still training. Long hours, not much time for anything else." "A brain surgeon," Arlo said, the awe evident in his voice. He turned to the audience. "Let's think about that. These hands," he said, gesturing to Elena's hands, "that just rebuilt Rachmaninoff out of thin air. They spend their days rebuilding people's lives in a very different way. The precision, the focus, the steady nerve. It's not so different, is it? It's all a kind of profound listening. Listening to the music of the body instead of the piano." It was a connection no one had made, but it made perfect sense. The audience murmured in agreement. "Would you play again?" The question came from somewhere in the dark of the hall. A man's voice, brave enough to shout it out. All eyes turned back to Elena. She looked startled by the direct question. She glanced at Arlo, then down at the keyboard. The fear was gone, but a deep, familiar caution was still there. I don't know," she said honestly. "This was a moment. A beautiful, unexpected moment. But my life is in the hospital now. My patients are waiting for me at 7 tomorrow morning. The piano and we had our reunion. It was more than I ever thought I'd have." Arlo watched her. He heard the finality in her voice. It wasn't bitter. It was resolved. She had made her choice years ago, and she stood by it. But he also heard the love that had just poured out of her through the music. An idea, fragile and hopeful, began to form in his mind. Not to change her path, but to honor both parts of her. "Would you," he asked, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "consider one more thing? Not for the audience. Not for anyone else. For you, and for your sister who couldn't be here tonight." Elena looked at him, curious, wary. He gestured to the piano. "You said Rachmaninoff was her favorite. That she said it sounded like brave hearts. You just played the storm. Would you? Would you play the answer? The beautiful singing melody that comes after the storm? The one that sounds like hope, fighting its way through?" He was talking about the second soaring theme of the concerto's first movement. It was one of the most famously gorgeous melodies ever written. It was the light after the darkness she had just poured out. Elena's lips parted. She looked from his earnest face to the piano. She thought of her sister's face, beaming with pride, from her hospital bed all those years ago, then laughing as she handed her this ticket. The no that was on her lips dissolved. This wasn't a request for another performance. It was an offering, a chance to complete the thought for herself. Slowly, she turned her body back to the keys. She didn't close her eyes this time. She looked at them with a new familiarity, a tenderness. She began. The notes were different now. Where the opening had been all thunderous chords and anguished falling rain, this was a gentle rising sun. The melody unfolded, lush and lyrical, singing out with a heartbreaking sweetness. She played it more simply than the first part, without the furious technical display. She played it with feeling. It was a lullaby. It was a memory of a sister's smile. It was a testament to survival. Tears flowed freely now in the audience. Arlo simply listened, his head bowed. He had played this melody 100 times, but he had never heard it sound like this. It wasn't perfect, a slight hesitation in one transition, a note not quite as loud as the score might demand, but it was more truthful than any perfect performance could be. It was her truth. She played the phrase to its natural, quiet conclusion, letting the last note hang and fade into a silence that was now warm and full. No one applauded. It didn't feel right. The moment was too private, even here in a room full of people. It was a gift she had given herself, and they had been allowed to witness it. Arlo finally moved. He stood up and walked to the edge of the stage, speaking to his stage manager in the wings. He returned with a bottle of water and handed it to Elena. She took it with a grateful, shaky smile and drank. Then he addressed the crowd again. "I think we've all been given more than we paid for tonight," he said, his voice strong again, but filled with a new gravity. "I came here to play a program, but the real music happened in a way none of us could have planned. Life has a way of doing that, doesn't it? The most beautiful symphonies aren't always the ones written on paper." He looked at Elena, then back at the audience. "So, with your permission, I'm going to change the rest of my program tonight. I'm going to play a piece that feels right. And I'm going to ask our remarkable guest, Dr. Elena, if she would do us the honor of simply sitting here and listening. Not as a doctor, not as a sister, not as a ghost of a pianist. Just as herself. A person who reminded us all what real beauty sounds like." He extended his hand to her, not to lead her away, but to invite her to stay. After a moment's surprise, she took it. He helped her up and led her to a comfortable chair that was quickly brought to the side of the stage, just outside the main spotlight. Arlo returned to the piano. He sat, gathered himself, and began to play. He chose something gentle and kind, and full of light, maybe a piece by Schubert. He played for her. He played for her sister. He played for everyone in the room who had ever had to choose one dream over another. And Elena, for the first time in 15 years, sat and simply listened to a concert. The ghost was quiet. The memory was sweet. And the future, for just this one night, felt peaceful. The final notes of Arlo's chosen piece, a gentle flowing work by Schumann, faded into a grateful silence. Then the applause began again, warm and sustained, but it felt different now. It wasn't for a single shocking moment, or even for a heartbreaking story. It was for the whole, strange, beautiful journey of the evening. It was for the shared feeling in the room. As the clapping slowly died down, the normal rhythms of a concert night tried to reassert themselves. The house lights brightened slightly from their theatrical gloom. People began to gather coats, to murmur to their neighbors, their voices a soft, excited buzz. But no one rushed for the exits. There was a sense that no one wanted the spell to break just yet. On stage, Arlo stood and gave a final deep bow to the audience, then turned and offered his hand to Elena. She took it, rising from the chair at the side of the stage. Together, they walked to center stage one last time. He didn't lift her hand in victory. He simply stood beside her, a quiet show of solidarity as they accepted the crowd's final thanks. Then, with a last wave, he guided her gently toward the wings. Backstage was a world of hushed chaos stagehands moving quietly, the stage manager smiling and giving a thumbs up. The moment the heavy curtain blocked them from the audience's view, the formal tension dissolved. Elena's shoulders slumped, not with sadness, but with the sheer physical and emotional release of it all. She leaned against a cool brick wall, closing her eyes for a second. "Are you all right?" Arlo asked, his voice soft with concern. The showman was completely gone. He was just a man who had witnessed something profound and wanted to make sure the person at the center of it was okay. Elena opened her eyes and nodded. "I think so. Just a lot. I can't even imagine," he said. He gestured to a cluttered dressing room door that was slightly ajar. "Would you like to sit? We can avoid everyone for a few minutes." She nodded gratefully, and he led her into the small, bright room. It was filled with the usual clutter, a vase of slightly wilted flowers, a tray of untouched fruit, sheet music scattered on a table. It smelled of dust and rosin. He cleared a stack of books from a worn velvet armchair for her and pulled up a wooden stool for himself. For a minute, they just sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the departing crowd. The roar in Elena's ears was finally starting to quiet. "I meant what I said out there," Arlo began, folding his hands. "That was the most honest music I've heard in a long time. Maybe ever." Elena gave a small, tired smile. "It felt reckless and necessary, like pulling a thorn out of my heart I didn't know was still there." "And the thorn?" he asked gently. "It's out," she said, and she sounded sure. "The hurt is still a part of the story, but it's not stuck anymore." She looked at him, her gaze direct. "Thank you for that. For pushing. Even if you were just being mischievous." He laughed, a short, genuine sound. "My mischievous days are over. You've ruined me for life. I'll be terrified to ever call anyone up from an audience again." His expression grew more serious. "Your work. It's everything. What you do. I hope you know that this," he waved a hand toward the stage, "doesn't take anything away from that. If anything, it just proves you have a superhuman capacity for beautiful, difficult things." "They feel like opposite worlds," Elena admitted. "One is all feeling and sound and letting go. The other is all logic and silence and holding steady. But they both need the same hands," Arlo said. "Steady, knowing, compassionate hands." He paused, as if an idea was still forming. "Look, I don't want to be another person telling you to change your life. The world needs you exactly where you are. But would you allow the music to be a friend again, and not a ghost?" She looked at him, curious. "I tour a lot," he said. "But when I'm in the city, I have a studio. It has a good piano. The door is always locked, and it's always quiet. No audiences. No expectations. If you ever need a place to just stand in that sunlight again, it's there. No questions asked. You could just come and play for the walls, or for yourself, or for no reason at all. Just so you remember it's yours, too." The offer was so simple, so free of pressure, that it caught Elena off guard. It wasn't a concert invitation. It wasn't a demand on her future. It was a key to a quiet room. A tremendous kindness. Tears welled in her eyes again, but they were quiet tears. That would be a kind of healing I didn't know I needed," she whispered. "Thank you." There was a soft knock on the door. The stage manager poked his head in. "Arlo, they're asking for you at the stage door." "Quite a crowd. And, there are a few reporters." Arlo sighed, the real world pressing back in. He looked at Elena. "You can slip out the back. I can have someone take you to your car. You've given enough tonight." But Elena shook her head. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "It's okay. I'll come with you. For a minute. My sister will want to know I faced the music, literally and figuratively. A faint, playful glint returned to her eye. Besides, I think I've forgotten how to be shy for a little while. Together, they walked down the narrow, concrete corridors to the stage door. When the security guard pushed it open, the noise hit them. A crowd of 50 or 60 people had gathered behind a barrier, holding programs and phones. When they saw Arlo, they cheered. When they saw Elena beside him, the cheer turned into something more, a chorus of shouts of bravo. And thank you. A young woman thrust a program and a pen toward Elena. Please, could you? She asked, her eyes wide. Elena, looking startled, took the pen and signed her name, just her first name, next to Arlo's flamboyant signature. It was the first autograph she had ever given. More programs were offered, and she signed a few, her hand growing steadier with each one. A reporter with a voice recorder managed to get close. Dr. Elena, will you return to the piano? Will you perform again? Elena looked at the reporter, then at the eager, kind faces around her. She thought of the quiet room Arlo had offered, and of the noisy, vital hospital waiting for her. I'm a neurosurgeon, she said clearly, her voice finding its strength again. That's my job, and it's my calling. The piano is my heart. And tonight, I learned that it's okay to listen to your heart, even if you don't follow it onto a stage. She smiled. I think I'll just play for the people I love. And maybe, sometimes, for a very quiet, empty room. It was the perfect answer. It honored her past without betraying her present. The crowd applauded her again, understanding that soon after. Arlo's assistant gently guided Elena away, through the crowd and to a waiting car. As she slid into the back seat, the sounds of the night became muffled and soft. She looked out the window at the city lights blurring past. Her phone, turned off for the duration of the concert, buzzed to life in her purse. She turned it on. There were a dozen missed calls and a flood of text messages. The most recent was from her sister. It contained no words, just a string of crying face emojis, followed by heart emojis, followed by a single line. Asterisk, asterisk, I always knew. I'm so proud of you. Now come over for breakfast. I'm making pancakes. Asterisk, asterisk, Elena laughed, a real, free, happy laugh that filled the quiet car. She typed back, asterisk, asterisk, see you in the morning. I'll bring the maple syrup. Asterisk, asterisk, she leaned her head against the window. The echo of the piano was still in her bones, a pleasant, fading vibration. It didn't hurt. It felt like a part of her had been tuned after years of being slightly out of key. She wasn't a concert pianist. She was a doctor who had once been a pianist and who had, for one miraculous night, gotten to visit her old self and introduce her to the woman she had become. The car moved through the streets, carrying her away from the bright lights of the concert hall, back toward the quiet, ordinary, and deeply meaningful life she had built. But something had changed. The silence in her apartment wouldn't feel so heavy anymore. The closed lid of her own piano at home wouldn't feel like a tomb. It would feel like a friend, waiting patiently for the next time she needed to hear its voice. And she knew with a calm certainty that she would, not for an audience, but for herself. The music, after its long sleep, was finally awake.